The Japan of 1945 was one that had witnessed the collapse of its old society brought upon by the Meiji era. Yet, within the years to follow, it would see a new era marked by an everlasting policy bringing both prosperity and hardship to the reformed nation. With the conclusion of the Second World War in 1945, Japan was left in a collapsed state, being one of the many Axis nations defeated by the Allies. Upon its occupation by the victors led by the United States, Japan was forced to bear many changes to its shattered state and governmental system. Of these changes was the adoption of Japan's 1947 constitution, which pushed Japan into a newfound democracy. Yet Japan would follow the path of pacifism, one outlined by Article 9 in the constitution, stating Japan will renounce its prospects of war and its willingness to remain as a peaceful nation. Through the continued adherence of this policy, even into the 21st century, Japan became renowned as a pacifist nation who rebuilt itself and spread the idea of peace throughout East Asia. Yet despite this, no concept or policy could ever remain uncontested, something that is ever more clear as Japan maneuvers through the complicated and heated politics of the world. Through today's video, we'll be taking a look at Japan's pacifism as outlined in its 1947 constitution, and specifically how it has begun to fail. As seen through Japan's own pursuit of national security, the rise of new threats from neighboring countries, and pressure for militarization by allied nations. In order to fully analyze the crumbling policy of pacifism in Japan, it is important to understand what is meant by Japanese pacifism. The principle of pacifism came about with the 1947 Constitution, specifically in Article 9, which banned anti-militarist policies in Japan, such as that of war. Through this restriction, it in effect forced Japan to adopt a pacifist stance, promoting it within its domestic education as well as its image abroad. This is not to say Japan was a fully pacifist nation as well, with the formation of the Self-Defense Force in 1954, as well as the policy of keeping national defense spending below 1% of gross domestic product in 1975. However, with such minor changes, it continues to highlight just how anti-militarist Japan had become, with little desire for remilitarization. In addition to this, some thinkers had adopted the idea of unarmed neutralism, a concept developed in the 1970s. For its many advocates, they expressed the need to remain unarmed in order to ensure peace in Japan. Many had equated it to Switzerland in World War II, who avoided invasion due to their neutrality. Even if an invasion did occur, they argued, a quick surrender towards the aggressor would allow for more controlled terms when compared to resistance. Nonetheless, Japan by the 21st century entered with these principles maintained, yet also begun to see its ideas shaken as more demand for self-defense increased with the precarious world order. The importance of national security is oftentimes what highlights the need for militarization, something that is evidently being reviewed by Japan in the 21st century. Prior to this, Japan had rarely attempted to fully pursue militarization due to Article 9, with some already protesting against the SDF, viewing it as unconstitutional. This is not to say that such ideas of militarization were non-existent, with the development of the Yoshida Doctrine due to concerns of security in the Cold War era. Within this doctrine, it stressed that Japan required minimal militarization and instead highlighted reliance on the United States for external threats. However, through this doctrine, it bred many different thoughts of remilitarization during the late 1900s. Some, like Masashi Nishihara, believe similarly to the Yoshida Doctrine of minimal rearmament and heavy reliance on the United States in fear of a militarist Japan returning. Other individuals, like Hisahiko Okazaki, advocated for the need for heavy rearmament due to its geographical location being an inevitable war ground, similar to how nations like Denmark were forced into World War II. Finally, there are some who favor militarism, such as Tetsuya Kataoka, who believe Japan needs to be self-reliant on its military policies, not trusting U.S. commitment in Japan. And while such thinking was viable during the 1900s, much of it changed as Japan entered the 2000s, with a world greatly shaken with the end of the Cold War. One of the greatest changes in policy for Japan was led by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in the 2010s, who sought to remilitarize Japan. Abe had greatly pushed for remilitarization, with one news article expressing his belief that Japan should move on and be proud of its history rather than being apologetic. Despite this, Abe would never be able to revise Article 9, with the idea of changing Japan's pacifist stance being greatly disliked. This is evident with a poll in 2019 suggesting only 29% of the Japanese population actually wanted revision. Yet this does not mean pacifism has remained in Japan. In 2014, Abe was able to at least reinterpret Article 9, allowing for collective self-defense to be viewed as constitutional, allowing for the bolstering of defenses for deterrence of potential external threats. Along with this, Abe had made other efforts when it came to militarization with a 2015 legislation allowing the JSDF forces to work overseas, achieving a goal for collective self-defense. And as well, later on, he allowed for the possible modification of the Izumo destroyer in 2018. Abe had also successfully formed the National Security Council back in 2013 due to a hostage situation in Algeria leading to 10 Japanese citizens dead in the crisis. Even upon his death in 2022, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida carried out the security policy with an increased defense budget, addressing that there are limits to pacifism. While Article 9 had pretty much remained in the Constitution, it had in many ways become obsolete for the insistence of his policies during his term as Prime Minister and beyond. However, in spite of that, it could not be said that this was something Abe had been pushing on his own. Many politicians has also been in debates of the need for preemptive strike capabilities, however this topic has been treaded carefully. When it came to how constitutional the JSDF were after its establishment in the 1950s, the court rulings had in effect avoided dealing with it, believing interpretation is not required unless explicitly said so. Without a doubt, with the constant increase of the need for national security, Japan has continued to move away from Article 9 of its 1947 constitution, something which may signify a future constitutional revision. Although it would be incorrect to state that these policies are solely influenced by domestic politics, or the relentless ideal of one man. Inevitably, the increased concerns of national security within Japan is greatly influenced by the increase of external threats towards the island nation, something that continues to grow as the years pass. Oftentimes in history, one of the biggest threats towards peace in a nation is due to the aggressive actions of antagonizing states, something that Japan witnesses in increasing inconvenience to say the least. With the conclusion of the Cold War in the 1990s, Japan had seen the end of the looming Soviet threat. However, it was instead replaced by its closest neighbors. These neighbors happen to be China and North Korea, where one seeks expansion and the other provides a great nuclear threat. These threats are evidently recognized through Shinzo Abe's stance back in 2006, believing the two nations threaten Japan's pacifism, going so far as stating the possibility of acquiring first strike capabilities on North Korea. When looking into China, the two nations had previously been more friendly during the Cold War, seeing Japan's attempts at diplomacy for providing economic aid to China in the 1970s. However, this changed with the rising economic superpower of China, who began pursuing a hostile approach towards Japan. One such policy that threatened Japan was the Taiwan Strait crisis, which witnessed China's attempt at shaking the status quo. While Japan does not have any obligations towards Taiwan, the strait as well as trade routes surrounding both China and Taiwan acts as a vital role for the importation of oil from the Middle East. Yet one of the biggest issues brought upon Japan is the claim by China on the Senkaku Islands. Japan's Senkaku Islands are part of the Ryukyu Island chain, which includes islands such as that of Okinawa. Back in World War II, they were given to the US administration, and thus, as a result, while the islands such as Taiwan and the Pescadores were returned to China, the Senkakus remained in uncertainty until the end of the US occupation, which saw its return to Japan. This was something both Taiwan and China had both accepted at the time, but by 1971, China protested against Japan's ownership. Some have suggested China's actions were motivated by petroleum within the islands, which perhaps could be the case, as by 1992, the issue was brought up again with the introduction of the Territorial Water Law, which further claimed the territory. This is despite the previous agreement to drop the issue back in 1972. Regardless, China continues to bring up the issue of the islands, continuously infringing on Japan's territory for sending vessels around the region. By contrast, North Korea provides the threat of nuclear Armageddon rather than expansionist policies. Starting from the 1990s, North Korea had begun investing in the development of both missiles as well as nuclear weapons, inevitably causing great concern towards the nation of Japan. This concern is further enhanced upon the continued testing of missiles that violate Japan's airspace and territory, inevitably causing fear on what is an actual test and what is an attack. Due to such dangers, Japan had been more eager to invest in tactical missile defense systems as a reaction to further militarization of North Korea. Along with this, some like Shigeru Ishiba proposed the need for preemptive strike capabilities as a self-defense measure in case of a known North Korean attack. With the continued threat by China and North Korea of either interference or even a first strike, it becomes unquestionable that Japan would desire to shift away from the policy of pacifism as outlined in Article 9. If Japan were to maintain the policy of Article 9 within such threats of violence within its closest neighbors, it in many ways would solely spell the desire to be conquered rather than maintaining pacifism. While foreign adversaries are a great influence towards the shifting interpretation of Article 9, what cannot be ignored is the ability of peer pressure for militarization, something Japan's allies attempt to influence. There can be no denial that when countries work closely together or are allied in some way or form, there is the constant influence of one's policy onto another, something that is clearly evident with Japan and its pacifism. While Japan had maintained its stance on being a pacifist country, it has certainly been encouraged to change towards a more militarist one that has been greatly influenced by the United States. This internal conflict had already been ongoing in its earliest days of the 1947 Constitution, with the introduction of the Korean War in 1950. Despite efforts by the United States to remilitarize Japan, the government under Yoshida Shigeru managed to resist the pressure, but did allow for some armament in order to receive protection. Unfortunately for pacifism, this was the beginning of Japan's spiraling path of accepting US pressure, with more disregard on Article 9 as time went on. This is clearly seen in 1978, which witnessed joint military operations with the United States, bolstering Japan's military capability. As well, in 2006, the United States applauded Shinzo Abe's stance on North Korea, believing Japan would witness changes to its pacifist policies. This change can be evidently seen in 2017, where in declaration by President Donald Trump to buy more American weaponry, Japan had invested in acquiring the Aegis Ashore, a missile defense shield. On the other hand, an increased fear of becoming a distant ally of the US had also pushed Japan into bolstering their self-defense capabilities to aid them, especially as Japan's neighbors reacted even more hostile towards them. This belief is greatly emphasized during the Persian Gulf War in 1990, where the United States criticized Japan for its limited aid in the war with no military force active in the field. It is evident that through all these efforts made by the United States, it ultimately aided in shifting Japan's perspective of Article 9 and pacifism towards that of increased militarism for national security. This, combined with influential leaders in favor of remilitarization and foreign threats, all contribute towards a Japan that seeks to abandon Article 9 of the 1947 Constitution, if not in the present, then certainly in the future. Pacifism was certainly a beneficial concept for Japan upon the end of the Second World War. Yet through Japan's own intellectual propositions of national security, the fear of hostile nations who exist as threats, and the encouragement of friendly nations to remilitarize, this inevitably damaged Japan's pursuit of peace as outlined in Article 9. While the concept of a pacifist nation is certainly an ideal that many nations should strive for, in the case of Japan, it is something that is becoming less and less tenable, especially in the present day. The 1947 Constitution and Article 9 are something formed in the aftermath of the Second World War, whose principles may not be as ideal in the current times. Thus, this highlights the importance of many nations other than Japan to move away from staunch conservatism within their constitution. As times change, so do the world nations exist in, with the constant need to adapt in order to survive the shifting world order. It is with hope that through the example of Japan and its failure to uphold the principles of Article 9, that future politicians will pursue change rather than resist it. Thank you for watching.